Do you know where your clothes came from? I've always been fascinated with the process of making garments, from the fibers to fabrics, dyes, pattern making, sewing, and construction. These parts usually happen all over the world and across many countries. But I am going to try and do it all right here in Alberta, using local materials and with the help of skilled artisans and knowledgeable people in our community. My name is Erin, and the idea to make an entirely local garment has been on my mind for years, since I read Fiber Shed by Rebecca Burgess, where she talks about making an outfit from the materials and skills in her neighborhood, and seeing how beautiful, educational, and celebratory that process can be. We are currently drowning in fast fashion and the overproduction of clothing. These days, clothing is seen as something disposable, and brands are racing to the bottom to make garments as cheaply as possible, which comes at a cost to the environment and workers. This project for me is the ultimate slow fashion journey, and my goal is to make something beautiful that I'm going to wear for the rest of my life. It is definitely going to be a challenge to make everything locally, but it's an opportunity to learn and experience a process we're usually completely removed from. Now, this project involves a lot of textile skills that many people would actually consider lost here in Canada. So I began by doing some research on what making clothes was like, especially locally, before production moved overseas. I live in the city of Edmonton. We're in the middle of the prairies, and no one would consider Edmonton to be a fashion city or one that has a garment industry. So I was quite surprised to learn that there actually used to be significant clothing manufacturing here. For most of the 1900s, Edmonton was home to Great Western Garments, or GWG, a major denim and workwear manufacturer that played an important role in our city.
My name is Catherine Cole, and I am originally from Ontario, but moved to Alberta in 1983. So I came out here as a museum curator with a background specifically in costumes and textiles. The company was established in Edmonton in 1911. Rutherford, our first premier, was also one of the three founders of GWG. It was just several local men who could see the potential for a company like this to produce the kind of clothing that people needed to wear out here. I didn't know that it was an Alberta company until I moved here, and so that just really kind of made me think about why I didn't know that, and also about how the company grew in such a strong Western context. So by the time I was familiar with them in the 70s, they were trying to sort of get away from that perception of them as being Western to being more Canadian and more fashion-oriented rather than workwear-oriented. They were known primarily for workwear. Right, yeah. And so because they always did jackets, right? Mm-hmm. So they did Mackinac coats, they did plaid shirts, the iconic Canadian plaid shirts. In the early days, they also did, or in the 50s, I guess, they did some novelty things as well. So they did children's little cowboy costumes and things. In the 60s and 70s, they started getting into, it was still mostly denim, but it was colored denim, not blue denim. And so they tried to get in more into fashionable clothing. I mean, one of my favorite pairs of pants from the 70s was called the Peace Jean, and it was a blue and purple and white striped jean that had buttons up the fly that had peace symbols on them. Well, in terms of what you're trying to do, I think it's interesting that GWG did try to produce using local fabric as well, right, with the West wool. I would like to know more about why that failed. The pre-wash jeans, the scrubbies look, that's an Edmonton thing. And nobody in Edmonton knows that. I mean, the thought that wearing pre-wash jeans was invented in Edmonton is pretty amazing. He was traveling in Europe with his wife, and they saw these used jeans being sold in markets in Europe. And so he started talking to his wife about, when you first buy the kids' jeans, do they wear them right away? She says, no, I wash them first so that they're softer and more comfortable for them to wear. So he thought, well, why don't we wash them before we make them?
See, denim When you weave, the old-fashioned shuttles went back and forth at 40 miles an hour. And when that shuttle went through, it could break a strand very easy. So they soaked the threads in potato starch. That's why jeans were so stiff when you bought them, because nobody washed the potato starch out. When I went down to see Gudis, Goldberg, and Soren on my next year's program, and I said, after our meeting, Jerry, I want you to keep a group of your young people back, youth people that wear blue jeans, for a private conference. I've got an idea and I want it to be kept confidential. Tell these kids what the idea is and they just jump out of their chairs. Thank God, I've ruined more jeans by putting bleach and wrong things in them. Oh God, I could just go in and buy them, and they were already shrunk to fit. The interesting thing was that Eaton's, I could never get in their door. In Montreal, a guy was starting to buy from us, and reluctantly. And I went to see him, and he looked at me and he said, I think you're absolutely right. I want 900 pair. 900 pair came into the Montreal store. It was unpacked on Friday. It hit the shelves. By Saturday, there wasn't one pair left. Never happened before in their history.
One of the reasons I find GWG so fascinating and wanted to talk about them is because they were quite advanced in terms of worker rights and welfare, especially for women and across industries, not just within garment manufacturing.
Now, if you're interested in factory life and textiles, it was established right after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, which was the worst disaster in the history of New York prior to 9/11. And so when they established this factory here, they wanted to make sure that this kind of terrible thing could not occur here. It was a fire. And the reason so many people died is because they'd locked the fire escapes so that people wouldn't go outside and have cigarettes and take breaks. And so they couldn't get out. And so they unionized the company really early, like within months of establishing the company. And partially, really mostly, I guess, because the company, it was workwear they were making. And so they wanted to be able to market their products to unionized workers. And whether it was railway workers or anybody working in a union, particularly starting in the West and then expanding beyond that. And so the fact that it was a unionized plant and they followed professional standards of wages and working conditions, hours of work, cleanliness, safety, all of those things, meant that people in other unionized businesses are more likely to buy their products. So the union-made label was a really important thing in the early 20th century. And their focus was twofold. It was on good, strong clothing at a reasonable price and safe working conditions for the largely female workforce that produced them. We've had the event of the founding of the union recognized as an event of national historic significance by Parks Canada because it was so early and because the women in this plant really set the working standards for women throughout the province in whatever industry women were working in. And there also specifically weren't a lot of employment opportunities for married women. So some of the women that we spoke with worked at GWG because they couldn't work anywhere else because they were married. They advertised in labor magazines, in early farming and country magazines, and they take out a 2-page spread showing a big picture of the factory and advertising the way women were working in there. So it was a big part of promoting who they were. In Alberta, when we did introduce a minimum wage for women, there was a representative from GWG on the panel for the government that identified what those wages should be. So the plant was always very influential in terms of the government policies, which were responding to good working conditions. So it was a very positive place for women to work, and that remained true even after the focus on working conditions and standards. But the feeling in the plant, when I interviewed women who worked there in the 70s and 80s, by then it was a totally different workforce. It was largely immigrant women, and the lines were usually organized by language group and country. And so they developed a real relationship with the other women in their line. And one of the women I interviewed, who was Vietnamese and from an educated family, she was a school teacher herself in Vietnam, and she started this job as a stopgap measure until her English was good enough to go on to something else. But after she'd been working here for a while, she really liked working in a female-dominated workplace and having that support of the other women.
I find it quite interesting to look back to companies like GWG and see how the garment industry has changed, because in many cases, it has not really changed much or actually changed for the worse.
The fire in Bangladesh a few years ago, the factory fire there, was very similar to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It's still happening today. It's just not happening under our noses because we wouldn't accept it if we could see it. But if it happens in Bangladesh, we don't care. And I think that's horrible. Everybody wants to buy something cheap that they can toss out and replace. It's a whole attitudinal shift. But how did we get to that point? Right? I guess that's what we need to do, is to go back and look at how did that attitude change? Because it really changed in the late 70s, early 80s. Until then, we were trying to buy quality stuff. And in the last 5 or 10 years, it's just escalated beyond anything. I think if people knew how their clothes were produced today, they wouldn't be buying them. And I think about the way I was raised, to buy good quality things that will last, right? You don't buy a new coat every winter, let alone 3 in one winter. You want your winter coat to last you 5 years, and so you buy a good one.
Our collective priorities have definitely changed. Buying something well-made, locally made, union-made are not really valued the way that they were. But I also think that there is a shift back to quality and supporting local manufacturing and small brands. I've spoken with many people who are tired of microtrends and shopping and terrible quality clothing. So while there is no doubt it'll be challenging, I think this project is coming at the right time. Even though Edmonton isn't a city known for textiles or fashion, we do have incredibly talented and knowledgeable people here. We have people reclaiming and keeping textile skills alive, and we even have a history of quality garment manufacturing. So there is a solid foundation here to actually make a 100% locally made piece of clothing. Together, we're going to see and learn about every stage of production, from the farm to a finished piece in my closet. I always find an item of clothing is more special when it has a story behind it, and this is definitely going to be one interesting story.